Imagine being surrounded by 120,000 enemy soldiers in minus 35-degree weather, completely cut off from help, with your weapons freezing in your hands. That's exactly what happened to 30,000 troops at the Chosin Reservoir in 1950, and what came next would become the most brutal battle you've never heard about. The Korean War started in June 1950 when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. It caught everyone off guard. Within weeks, the North Koreans had pushed all the way down to a tiny area around Busan in the south. Things looked really bad for South Korea and the United Nations forces trying to help them. Then, General Douglas MacArthur pulled off something incredible. In September 1950, he launched an amphibious landing at Incheon, way behind enemy lines. It worked perfectly. The North Korean forces got cut off and had to run back north. Suddenly, the UN forces were winning. They pushed north, crossed the 38th parallel, and kept going. MacArthur wanted to reunify all of Korea under South Korean control. By late November 1950, UN forces were deep in North Korea, getting close to the Chinese border. MacArthur kept saying the war would be over by Christmas. The troops believed him. They thought they'd be home soon, enjoying the holidays with their families. But something was happening that would change everything. China was watching. They'd warned the United States not to come too close to their border, but nobody took them seriously. The Chinese leadership saw American troops approaching the Yalu River as a direct threat, so they made a decision. They would intervene, but they'd do it in secret. Starting in October, Chinese troops began crossing the border into North Korea, but they didn't march in broad daylight. They moved at night in complete silence. They hid in the mountains during the day. They used the terrain perfectly. American planes flying overhead saw nothing. Intelligence reports said there might be some Chinese volunteers in the area, but nothing to worry about. That was a massive mistake. The 1st Marine Division, along with Army units and some British Royal Marine Commandos, got orders to advance to the Chosin Reservoir. This is a massive artificial lake in the mountains of North Korea, created by a hydroelectric dam. The area around it is brutal terrain, mountains everywhere, one main road snaking through valleys. And in late November, it was getting cold, really cold. The temperature was already dropping below 0 Fahrenheit. That's before wind chill. The troops weren't properly equipped for this kind of cold. They had standard winter gear, but nothing designed for extreme Arctic conditions. Some guys were still wearing leather boots that would freeze solid. Medical supplies would freeze, vehicle fuel would gel up, weapons would jam. But they kept pushing north. The main force moved up the MSR, the main supply route, which was really just a narrow dirt road through the mountains. The 1st Marine Division spread out along this road, with different regiments positioned at various points. There was Udom-ni at the western edge of the reservoir, Ha-garu-ri at the southern tip, where the airstrip was, Kodo-ri further south, and Chinhung-ni even further down the road toward the coast. On the east side of the reservoir, there was an Army unit called Task Force Faith, named after Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith. They were positioned at the villages along the eastern shore. The plan was for all these units to push further north and west, sweeping through the area and finishing off any remaining North Korean resistance. Nobody realized that thousands of Chinese troops were already in the mountains watching them. The Chinese had positioned multiple armies around the reservoir. They had studied the American positions. They knew exactly where everyone was, and they were waiting for the perfect moment to attack. On the night of November 27, 1950, the temperature dropped to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. That's when the Chinese attacked. But they didn't attack like a conventional army. They came in waves, blowing bugles and whistles, screaming and firing. They hit the perimeter in massive human wave attacks. The Marines at Udamni suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives. The Chinese tactics were terrifying. They would send wave after wave of soldiers, accepting massive casualties to overwhelm positions. When one wave got cut down, another would come right behind it. They used the darkness and the terrain perfectly. They knew these mountains. The Americans didn't. At Fox Company's position on Fox Hill, about halfway between Udamni and Hagaru-ri, Captain William Barber and his men got hit hard. Fox Company was isolated, sitting on a hilltop guarding a critical pass. The Chinese knew if they could take that position, they could cut the road and prevent any retreat, so they threw everything at Fox Company. The fighting that night was brutal. Hand-to-hand combat in the freezing darkness. The Chinese would get right up to the foxholes before the Marines even saw them. Grenades flying back and forth. The noise was deafening. Bugles, whistles, shouting, gunfire, explosions, and it just kept coming, wave after wave. By morning, Fox Company had held their position, but they'd taken heavy casualties. Captain Barber was wounded but refused to be evacuated. He knew his men needed him, and he knew more attacks were coming. The Chinese had shown their hand now. Everyone realized the situation had completely changed. The Marines at Udamni tried to continue their attack west as ordered, but it was impossible. They were surrounded by Chinese forces that outnumbered them by a huge margin. After one day of trying to advance, they got orders to turn around and fight their way back to Hagaru-ri. The breakout had begun. But first, they had to rescue Fox Company, which was still holding that critical pass. If Fox Hill fell, the road would be cut and thousands of Marines would be trapped. So they organized a relief column to fight through several miles of Chinese-controlled territory to reach Fox Company. It took days of constant fighting. Meanwhile, on the east side of the reservoir, Task Force Faith was getting destroyed. The Chinese hit them with overwhelming force. These soldiers were even less prepared for the cold than the Marines. Their weapons were freezing. Vehicles wouldn't start. The wounded were dying from the cold as much as from their wounds. It was hell. Lieutenant Colonel Faith tried to organize a breakout convoy. They loaded all the wounded onto trucks and tried to fight their way south along the road. But the Chinese had roadblocks set up. They had troops in the hills firing down on the convoy. Vehicle after vehicle got hit and caught fire. The wounded inside burned alive or died trying to escape into the snow. Don Faith himself was killed leading an attack against a Chinese position. The convoy fell apart. Some soldiers made it across the frozen reservoir on foot to reach friendly lines. Many didn't. Task Force Faith effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Out of about 2,500 men, only about 1,000 made it out, and many of those were wounded. It was a disaster. Back with the main Marine force, the situation was desperate but more organized. The Marines were trained for this kind of fighting. They maintained discipline even under extreme conditions. But the cold was becoming as much of an enemy as the Chinese. Weapons would freeze and jam. The M1 Garand rifles would fail. Machine guns would freeze after firing a few rounds. Mortars would crack from the cold. Even the new M1 carbines, which a lot of guys carried because they were lighter, turned out to be almost useless in extreme cold. They'd fire a round or two and then jam. The Marines learned to urinate on their weapons, to thaw them out. They'd keep grenades inside their jackets to keep them from freezing. They'd rotate who got to stand near the fires to warm up for a few minutes. They'd share body heat with wounded buddies to keep them alive. Every small action became a struggle against the cold. Medical care was almost impossible. Morphine would freeze solid in the syrettes. Plasma for blood transfusions would freeze. Doctors performed surgeries in unheated tents with frozen hands. They'd amputate frostbitten limbs with hacksaws because that's all they had. The wounded would be laid out in rows in the snow because there was nowhere else to put them. The Marines fought their way back to Hagaru-ri, carrying their wounded and their dead. The Marine Corps has a tradition of never leaving anyone behind, and they maintained that even under these conditions. If a guy went down, his buddies would carry him. If someone died, they'd carry the body rather than leave it for the enemy. It made the fighting withdrawal slower and harder, but nobody even considered leaving their guys behind. At Hagaru-ri, there was an airstrip, but it was barely usable. Engineers had carved it out of the frozen ground, but it was short and rough. Still, it was a lifeline. Cargo planes started flying in supplies and flying out the most seriously wounded. The pilots who flew those missions were incredibly brave. They'd come in under fire, land on a primitive strip surrounded by mountains in terrible weather, and take off again with the plane overloaded with wounded. Some of the stories from those flights are incredible. Pilots would cram wounded into every inch of space in the plane. Guys would be lying on top of each other. The planes were so overloaded they could barely get airborne. But the pilots knew if they didn't take everyone, those men would die. So they pushed their aircraft beyond safe limits and somehow got them in the air. The Chinese kept attacking. Every night, waves of troops would hit the perimeter at Hagaru-ri. The Marines would fight them off. Then, during the day, they'd have to patrol outside the perimeter to push the Chinese back and recover equipment or casualties from the night's fighting. There was no real rest. You'd fight all night, then go out on patrol during the day, then fight again the next night. The cold caused more casualties than enemy fire. Frostbite was everywhere. Guys would lose toes, feet, fingers, hands. Some lost ears or noses. If your skin touched metal, it would freeze to it instantly. If you got sweaty during a firefight, that sweat would freeze and you'd develop hypothermia. Simply surviving hour to hour was a battle. After consolidating at Hagaru-ri, the Marines had to continue south to Koto-ri, then on to Chinhong-ni, and finally down to the coast at Hungnam. It was about 78 miles total through mountain passes, with Chinese forces all around them. The press started calling it a retreat. That made the Marines angry. Major General Oliver Smith, commanding the 1st Marine Division, said one of the most famous lines of the battle, "Retreat? Hell, we're not retreating, we're just advancing in a different direction." Another Marine officer said, "We're not retreating, we're attacking in another direction." The Marines saw it as a fighting withdrawal, not a retreat. They were moving to better positions while destroying enemy forces along the way. The column that moved south from Hagaru-ri was miles long. Trucks full of wounded, tanks, artillery pieces, thousands of Marines on foot. They moved slowly because they had to fight for every mile. The Chinese would set up roadblocks. They'd blow up bridges. They'd attack from the hills. The Marines would have to stop, fight, clear the roadblock, repair the bridge, and keep moving. One of the biggest obstacles was at Funchalen Pass, where the Chinese had blown up a critical bridge. There was no way around it. The pass was the only route through the mountains. Without that bridge, all the vehicles and heavy equipment would have to be abandoned. The Marines called for an airdrop of bridge sections. The Air Force managed to drop several massive bridge sections by parachute. Most of them were damaged on landing, but enough survived that engineers could put together a functioning bridge. They did it under fire in freezing temperatures with Chinese troops trying to stop them. Once the bridge was in place, the entire column moved across. Tanks, trucks, artillery, everything. It was an incredible feat of engineering and courage. The Marines finally reached Hungnam on the coast in mid-December. They'd fought their way through 78 miles of Chinese-controlled territory in the worst weather imaginable while heavily outnumbered. They brought out their wounded, they brought out their dead, they brought out their equipment, and they inflicted massive casualties on the Chinese forces trying to stop them. The evacuation from Hungnam was huge. Not just the Marines, but other UN forces, South Korean troops, and thousands of North Korean refugees who were fleeing the Chinese. The ships took everyone who wanted to leave. Then the port facilities were destroyed so the Chinese couldn't use them. The entire UN force in eastern North Korea was successfully evacuated by sea. The Chinese claimed victory because they'd pushed the UN forces back from the border. MacArthur's prediction about being home by Christmas was obviously wrong. The war would continue for more than 2 more years. But in terms of the actual battle, the 1st Marine Division had accomplished something remarkable. They'd been surrounded and outnumbered by at least 4 to 1, possibly more. They'd fought in the coldest combat conditions American troops had ever faced. They'd suffered terrible casualties from both combat and cold. But they'd fought their way out, maintained unit cohesion, and destroyed multiple Chinese divisions in the process. The Chinese casualties at Chosin were massive. Entire divisions were rendered combat ineffective. Some units suffered 60 to 70% casualties. Many of those casualties were from the cold. The Chinese troops were even less prepared for the winter than the Americans. They had thin cotton uniforms. Many didn't have proper boots. They had minimal rations. Chinese soldiers froze to death in their fighting positions. There are accounts of Marines finding Chinese soldiers frozen solid at their posts, still holding their weapons. Some had frozen while trying to throw grenades. The cold killed thousands of Chinese troops. Their logistics couldn't keep up with their armies. They couldn't evacuate their wounded. It was a disaster for them too, even though they achieved their strategic objective of pushing UN forces away from the border. For the individual soldiers and Marines who fought at Chosin, the experience was life-changing. Many suffered permanent damage from frostbite. The psychological trauma was severe. These guys had been through combat before, but nothing like this. The combination of brutal fighting, extreme cold, isolation, and overwhelming enemy numbers created a level of stress that's hard to imagine. There are stories of incredible heroism from the battle. Private First Class Hector Caffarata held off hundreds of Chinese troops by himself for hours, throwing back grenades and firing his rifle until it ran out of ammunition, then fighting with his entrenching tool and his fists. He was wounded multiple times but survived. He received the Medal of Honor. Captain William Barber, who commanded Fox Company on Fox Hill, kept his unit fighting for 5 days while surrounded, even after being wounded. He refused evacuation until his mission was complete. Medal of Honor. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis led a battalion through miles of Chinese-held territory to rescue Fox Company. Medal of Honor. There were 17 Medals of Honor awarded for actions at Chosin. 17! That tells you something about the level of combat. The Navy and Air Force pilots who supported the ground troops were heroes too. They flew in terrible weather conditions, often below minimums. They dropped supplies by parachute with incredible accuracy. They provided close air support even when they could barely see the ground. They evacuated the wounded under fire. Without them, the casualties would have been much worse. The Corsair pilots flying close air support would come in low and slow, hitting Chinese positions within meters of friendly troops. They'd use napalm, rockets, and machine guns. Sometimes they'd fly through enemy ground fire so thick it would shred their aircraft. Some planes came back with hundreds of bullet holes. Some didn't come back at all. One thing that comes through in all the accounts from Chosin is the importance of leadership and training. The Marines were well led at every level, from General Smith making strategic decisions, to battalion and company commanders leading their men in combat, to sergeants and corporals keeping their squads together in the chaos. Everyone knew their job and did it. The training paid off too. These guys knew how to fight at night. They knew how to coordinate with artillery and air support. They knew how to maintain their weapons, even in extreme conditions. They knew how to take care of each other. That training and those bonds between Marines made the difference between surviving and not surviving.
After Chosin, the 1st Marine Division was withdrawn from combat for rest and refitting. They'd lost about 900 killed and missing, and over 3,000 wounded. Thousands more had severe frostbite. The division needed time to recover. But they'd proven something important. Even under the worst possible conditions, facing overwhelming odds, well-trained troops with good leadership can accomplish seemingly impossible things. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir changed the Korean War. It showed that China was fully committed to the conflict and had the manpower to push UN forces back. It ended any hopes of a quick victory or reunification of Korea. It led to a stalemate that would eventually result in the armistice in 1953 that still defines the Korean Peninsula today. But for the men who fought there, Chosin was personal. It was about survival. It was about not letting down the guy next to you. It was about completing the mission no matter what. The survivors formed an organization called the Chosin Few. They meet every year to remember their fallen comrades and share their stories. Each year, there are fewer of them. Most of the Chosin Few are gone now. The battle deserves to be remembered. It was one of the most difficult fights in American military history. The conditions were horrific. The enemy was determined and brave. The outcome was uncertain. But the troops persevered. They fought with incredible courage. They looked out for each other. They completed their mission. There are lessons from Chosin that remain relevant today. The importance of good intelligence, the danger of overconfidence, the value of proper equipment for the conditions, the necessity of logistics and supply lines, the critical role of leadership, the power of training and discipline, the strength that comes from unit cohesion and loyalty to your fellow soldiers or Marines. The Korean War is sometimes called the Forgotten War because it happened between World War II and Vietnam and doesn't get as much attention. But the men who fought at Chosin haven't forgotten. The Korean people haven't forgotten. There's a monument at the Chosin Reservoir now. South Korea has memorials honoring those who fought for their freedom. The stories from Chosin need to be told and retold, not to glorify war, but to honor sacrifice, to remember what these young men endured. Most of them were in their late teens or early 20s. They were ordinary guys who did extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. They faced an enemy that outnumbered them massively, in weather that should have killed them, and they fought their way out. The Chinese soldiers deserve respect too. They were fighting for what they believed in. They endured the same terrible cold. Many of them were as young as the Americans and came from poor backgrounds. They fought bravely and died in huge numbers. War is always a tragedy, and Chosin was especially tragic because of the conditions and the casualties on all sides. Understanding battles like Chosin helps us understand the reality of war. It's not glorious. It's not an adventure. It's brutal, terrifying, painful, and traumatic. Men die in horrible ways. Others are wounded physically and psychologically. Families are shattered. The costs are enormous. Sometimes war is necessary, but it should never be undertaken lightly, and the soldiers who fight deserve our respect and support. The frozen ground of the Chosin Reservoir holds the memory of thousands who died there. American, British, South Korean, and Chinese soldiers all bled into that ground. Their sacrifice shouldn't be forgotten. The survivors carried physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. They rarely talked about what they experienced because it was too painful, too intense. But historians and journalists eventually recorded many of their stories, and those accounts give us a window into what they endured. Reading the accounts, you realize how much luck played a role in who survived and who didn't.
A guy could be standing next to you 1 second and dead the next. You could step one way and be fine, or step another way and hit a mine or get shot. You could get on one truck and make it to safety, or get on another truck and burn to death when it got hit. There wasn't always a rational explanation for who made it and who didn't. That randomness haunted many survivors. Why did I survive when my buddy didn't? What made me special? The answer is nothing made them special. It was chance. But that doesn't make it easier to accept. Survivor's guilt is real and powerful. Many Chosin veterans struggled with it for decades. The cold at Chosin was a unique horror. Most combat veterans can't fully understand what it was like because they never experienced that combination of extreme cold and intense combat. Your body is trying to keep you alive in sub-zero temperatures while you're also trying to fight and move and think clearly. Everything is harder. Everything hurts. You're exhausted, but you can't rest because you'll freeze. It's a special kind of hell. Some survivors said the worst part was seeing friends die from the cold, slowly. A guy would get wounded, and you couldn't evacuate him right away. You'd watch him fade over hours or days as the cold worked on him, despite your best efforts to keep him warm. Or a guy would get severe frostbite, and you'd know he was going to lose his feet or hands, but there was nothing you could do about it at that moment. The helplessness was crushing. But there were also moments of humanity in the midst of the horror. Enemies sharing cigarettes during a lull in fighting, Marines giving rations to starving North Korean refugees, medics treating enemy wounded after their own casualties were cared for, small acts of kindness that proved people could still be decent even in the worst circumstances. The equipment failures at Chosin led to improvements. The military developed better cold weather gear. They improved weapon designs to function in extreme temperatures. They changed policies about how troops would be equipped and supplied in winter conditions. These changes probably saved lives in later conflicts. Chosin taught lessons that were learned and applied. The Chosin campaign also demonstrated the value of the Marine Corps' combined arms approach. Infantry, artillery, tanks, engineers, and air support all working together. That integration was crucial to fighting through the encirclement. No single branch could have done it alone. It required coordination and mutual support. The Marines' training emphasized this integration, and it paid off at Chosin. General Smith's leadership was critical. He was methodical and careful, which frustrated some people who wanted faster movement, but his caution saved lives. He insisted on stockpiling supplies at Hagururi and building the airstrip there, even though that slowed the advance. When the Chinese attacked, those preparations made the difference. Hagururi became the anchor that held the whole defense together. Smith's decisions were vindicated by events. The relationship between the Marine Corps and the Army was sometimes tense during the Chosin campaign. There were disagreements about strategy and tactics. The Marines felt the Army wasn't aggressive enough in some situations. The Army felt the Marines were taking too many risks. These are normal inter-service tensions that happen in war, but they also point to the importance of unified command and clear communication. After Chosin, both services analyzed what went wrong and what went right. They tried to learn from the experience. The Army improved its winter warfare training. Both services worked on better cold weather equipment. Intelligence analysis was refined to try to prevent similar surprises. You never learn as much from success as you do from adversity, and Chosin was definitely adversity. The war continued after Chosin, but the front eventually stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel where it had started. There would be 2 more years of fighting, but it became more static, more like World War I trench warfare in some areas. Chosin was the last major mobile battle of the Korean War. Everything after that was grinding attrition. For the Chinese, Chosin was both victory and defeat. They achieved their goal of pushing UN forces away from their border. They showed they could fight the United States to a standstill. But they paid a terrible price in casualties. Their logistical system proved inadequate. They couldn't sustain major offensive operations for long. The Korean War would drag on, costing China hundreds of thousands of additional casualties without gaining much more territory. The strategic impact of Chosin was significant. It convinced the Truman administration that reunifying Korea by force was impossible without risking a wider war with China. It led to the firing of General MacArthur when he continued to push for escalation. It set the stage for the eventual armistice and the division of Korea that persists today. One battle in the mountains changed the course of history. But history is made by individual people making individual decisions under pressure. The battle wasn't just about grand strategy. It was about a sergeant deciding to lead another patrol, a private deciding to volunteer for a dangerous mission, a pilot deciding to make another run despite damage to his aircraft, a medic deciding to go into fire to reach a wounded Marine. Thousands of individual acts of courage added up to a collective achievement. That's what makes the Battle of Chosin Reservoir worth studying and remembering. It shows what humans are capable of under extreme duress. It demonstrates the power of training, leadership, and loyalty. It honors those who sacrificed everything in brutal circumstances. And it reminds us that freedom and security come at a cost, paid by people willing to endure things most of us can't imagine. The chosen few are almost all gone now. Within a few years, there won't be any survivors left. But their story remains. The frozen mountains of North Korea remember. The history books record their deeds. And those of us who come after have a responsibility to remember them, to tell their stories, and to make sure their sacrifice meant something. Subscribe for more untold stories from history's most intense battles.